In October 1962, the real world stood minutes away from nuclear war. America and Soviet Russia were at the brink of a nuclear holocaust. Missiles were armed, bombers were airborne, and both superpowers had already calculated how many millions would die. Less than 2 years later, Stanley Kubrick turned that fear into a dark comedy, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Not to mock the bomb, but to expose the madness behind the system that controlled it. This wasn't bad timing. This was deliberate. This is the story of how Cold War paranoia, real, documented global fear, became one of the greatest political satires ever made. I'm Teacher Eddie, the real historian, and this is Real Stories. Act 1. A world living under the bomb. By the early 1960s, nuclear war wasn't abstract. It was policy. Mutually assured destruction, MAD, wasn't a metaphor. It was official doctrine. The idea was simple. If either side launched, both sides would be annihilated. Peace was maintained through the promise of extinction. Children practiced duck and cover drills in classrooms. Families built fallout shelters in their backyard. Air raid sirens were tested routinely. By the early 1960s, nuclear war planning wasn't hypothetical. It was codified into something called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, or SIOP. SIOP was the United States Master Nuclear War Plan, a pre-scripted sequence of strikes targeting Soviet cities, military installations, and infrastructure. If activated, it wasn't limited. It wasn't restrained. It was massive retaliation. Entire urban populations were factored into strategic equations. In other words, the apocalypse had paperwork. And then came October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev stared at each other across a nuclear abyss. American U-2 spy planes photographed Soviet missile installations in Cuba. Naval blockades were formed. Strategic bombers stood ready. The world had never come closer to nuclear war. The psychological scar did not disappear when the crisis ended. It lingered, and Stanley Kubrick was paying attention. Act 2. Kubrick goes hunting for the truth. Kubrick did not set out to make a comedy. He began adapting a serious thriller, Red Alert by Peter George, a novel about a rogue U.S. general launching a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. Kubrick approached the material as a realist. He read extensively on nuclear strategy. He consulted experts. He studied strategic air command procedures. He learned about real fail-safe mechanisms. He examined the logic of deterrence. And the deeper he researched, the more disturbing something became clear. The logic of nuclear war was already absurd. Kubrick also studied the concept of launch-on warning, the idea that if early warning systems detected incoming Soviet missiles, the United States would launch its own nuclear arsenal before those missiles even landed. Think about that logic. Not confirmed impact, not confirmed destruction, just radar detection. One faulty signal, one misread reflection, one technical error, and civilization could end based on a false alarm. This wasn't satire. That was policy debate. The idea that global survival depended on rational actors under extreme pressure, human beings with egos, paranoia, and limited information, was terrifying. Kubrick realized something critical. If he filmed this straight, it would feel unrealistic, because reality itself had become surreal. So he pivoted, not to mock the bomb, but to expose the madness behind the systems controlling it. Thus, satire was born. Act 3. Paranoia as Policy. Dr. Strangelove's general, Jack D. Ripper, believes fluoridated water is a communist plot to corrupt, quote, our precious bodily fluids. It sounds ridiculous, but Cold War America was filled with conspiracy thinking. The Red Scare wasn't fiction. McCarthyism wasn't fiction. The government paranoia was real and politically weaponized. Kubrick didn't invent this fear. He exaggerated what already existed. The doomsday machine in the film, an automated device that would destroy the planet if triggered, felt outrageous. But real strategists had openly discussed similar deterrent mechanisms. The logic of automatic retaliation was part of nuclear theory. The war room in the film feels theatrical, but Strategic Air Command's real command centers were chillingly similar in design and authority structure. Kubrick understood something profound. The most terrifying part of nuclear war wasn't villainy, it was bureaucracy. The film's comedy works because it reveals a system so rigid, so procedural, so committed to its own logic that it cannot save itself. At the time, the U.S. military operated a program known as Operation Chrome Dome. Nuclear-armed B-52 bombers, flying continuously in the air, 24 hours a day, prepared to strike the Soviet Union at a moment's notice. Bombers carrying live hydrogen bombs circled the globe constantly, and accidents happened. Aircraft crashed, weapons were lost, close calls occurred. The world didn't just live under the bomb, it lived beneath planes carrying it. Kubrick didn't exaggerate readiness, he dramatized it. Act 4, Failsafe and the Race to Release. Kubrick wasn't alone in exploring this fear. In 1964, another film entered production, Failsafe, starring Henry Fonda. Same premise, accidental nuclear launch, military miscalculation, presidential crisis. But Failsafe was deadly serious. Not satire, no absurdity, pure dread. Kubrick realized if Failsafe came out first, his film might look like a parody of it, so he rushed Dr. Strangelove into release. There were even legal battles between the productions because of the overlapping subject matter. Kubrick won the race, and history proved that satire hit harder than solemn warning. Because by 1964, audiences didn't need to be told that nuclear war was terrifying. They already knew it. What they needed was a way to process it, and Dr. Strangelove did just that. Act 5, Timing, Tragedy, and Cultural Impact. The film's release was delayed after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in November of 1963. Nuclear tension was no longer theoretical. Political violence felt immediate. When Dr. Strangelove finally premiered in 1964, it didn't trivialize fear, it acknowledged it. Audiences laughed, but uneasily. The film became a cultural milestone, not because it mocked nuclear war, but because it exposed the absurd rationalizations beneath it. Kubrick showed that annihilation might not come from evil genius villains. It could come from procedural rigidity, from ego, miscommunication, from systems built on fear, from a simple mix-up or mistake. And that idea was far more disturbing. Conclusion: why it endures. Dr. Strangelove remains powerful not because it's funny, but because it's honest. Kubrick understood that Cold War paranoia wasn't irrational hysteria, it was a logical response to a world that had built weapons capable of ending civilization in minutes. The comedy works because the fear was real, and the satire endures because the system it critiqued were real. Dr. Strangelove didn't invent nuclear absurdity, it revealed that the absurdity was already there. This was the real story behind Dr. Strangelove and the real fears during the Cold War. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Real Stories. On our next episode, we'll take a closer look at the real-life boxer behind the film Raging Bull, Jake LaMotta. As a reminder, I upload new episodes weekly. Also, please join the Real Movie Discord. The link is in the description. And if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe for future videos. I'm Teacher Eddie, and this has been Real Stories, the truth behind the movies. Catch you next time, fam.